Hi, this is Tracy Hales Vass with Right on Four Corners on KSJE 90.9 FM in Farmington, New Mexico. Today I'm talking with Megan Baldridge from Albuquerque about her book, which won the Crafts Hobby Book Award at the New Mexico-Arizona Book Awards, Knitting Matters. Good morning, Megan.
Hi, Tracy. Good morning.
I really enjoyed your books, Knitting Matters, Knititude, and your other book, Unprecedented. Being a knitter, I could really relate to those.
Oh, good. Hopefully you could relate to the passion, but not the obsession.
I'm sorry, but I'm relating to the obsession also.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
That's what this is helping me realize that I may knit too much, and I may think about it too much, but by writing poetry about it, it helps. It's sort of like going to a counselor. It helps me try to put it in its place and realize that it's not the worst thing in the world to want to knit too much. Yeah, what do you like to knit?
Oh, I just started a year ago, and I'm now finishing my first sweater.
Wow, well, congratulations.
I'm having so much fun with it. Some of your poetry talks about my family is kind of full of knitting gifts, and I have enough scarves in my closet now, so I've got to expand my repertoire.
Well, I definitely recognize that in my family. They sort of like I have 3 sons and a daughter, and my sons started off, as soon as they could vocalize, they informed me that they didn't want to wear matching sweaters any longer, and they don't like vests, and vests are so much easier to make for them than sweaters.
Right.
So I've sort of given up on them, and my daughter is luckily still receiving presents, and still it seems to be happy to receive knitted gifts for special occasions, and so thankfully there's her.
That's great.
But it can be a burden on the family members of the knitter at times.
It can be.
But then I think they secretly enjoy it.
Right. And I appreciate the cash dashes of yarn here, there, and everywhere.
Well, I think that's a secret that people who don't know knitters don't realize, that we've squirreled away a lot of material just sort of with the idea that we might need it someday. I mean, knitting stores are always kind of going out of business because it's a tough business to be in. So there's always sales, and we're always accumulating. But it is a feeling of security for someone who likes to knit too much, to know that there's something maybe in the freezer. They have
exactly.
a skein or two of yarn, or under their bed they definitely have a lot of yarn.
You, of course, won the award for, what do they call it, crafts and hobby. But I think there should have been included poetry, because it's all very good.
Well, thank you. Thank you. The poetry, I actually entered last year and did not enter this year my poetry in the poetry category, because the poetry category is so very, very competitive, and there are so many really, really good poets in New Mexico, and there are not as many people who are writing about crafts or hobbies in a very serious way. So it was sort of a strategic decision to sort of apply where the category was a little less competitive, and that seemed to work this year. And I'm afraid I have some more knitting poetry books, because I think I sent you 3, and I have 5 of them, 2 of which I wrote this past year. So I'm going to re-enter that category, and I'm hoping that it also remains a little less competitive than the poetry category, because there's some just amazing poets in New Mexico, and I'm not one of those poets.
Well, there are amazing poets, yes, in New Mexico, but this is a contender.
Yeah, I like to sort of be a little lighthearted, because in this right now, because I think we're all this is a heavy time, and a little bit of a
Exactly.
dark time. And so I've been trying to look on the bright side and just think about the interesting, quirky aspects of modern life. And so I sort of found my niche in writing about knitting.
I like the way you weave in, no pun intended, weave in some of the, day to day and political issues into writing about knitting, which I think is really what knitting's about too. Knitting slowly while the rest of things are going on to contemplate, etc.
Well, yeah. Well, I think that's very true. I mean, it does give me a chance. It's been a very healthy thing for me to do in the last 10 years or so, and it does give me a chance to reflect on things and not react too quickly. But I think at the same time as we're doing something that we like, that's sort of mindful, that can be mindful, like knitting, we're also thinking about the rest of the world and thinking about this, the strange things that are going on. So I really couldn't separate those, and I felt also like I did want to comment on the, on politics and on some of the, and on my family members,
Right.
and on some of the interesting other curious things about which I have opinions. And so somehow, I guess I felt like I could weave things in. And if I wrote a serious political poem, it's a little harder for someone to read because it's maybe too serious or a little dark.
Right.
Whereas I can just weave a little bit of politics in a somewhat lighthearted way, but not. It's actually not so lighthearted, but I can look at it in a slightly lighthearted way and weave it into a knitting poem, and it's not gonna overwhelm someone else who's reading it with darkness.
Exactly.
And nor myself, because I did write a book which I think you've read about the campaign,
Yes.
our president during the campaign,
Yes.
and it did leave me feeling very kind of bleak.
Right.
And that's when I realized that I needed to look for some things that made me happy, which was knitting projects.
Right. I wondered about that. Now, do you have like a pad beside where you knit that you can stop and write a few words down?
Yes.
Or do you?
Yes. I have pads all over the house, and I have one in the car. I have one in my bag in my backpack, because usually the idea for a poem will come from just a sentence or something that someone else has said. Maybe it'll be a newscast, or I'll be sitting with a group of knitters at a community table at the yarn store, and someone will say something that's so interesting and it makes me think about, connects to other thoughts I've had in the past or that I want to explore. But if I wait for 2 hours until I'm home again or in next to my laptop, I will have forgotten that scrap.
Right.
So I do have to carry something around with me, or multiple ones, sort of like glasses. People who who are getting used to wearing reading glasses, who have glasses all over the place.
Exactly.
I have those, and sometimes I look at them 2 hours later and I think, I have no idea why I wrote what I wrote. I can't remember the context, and it doesn't mean anything now. But hopefully, most of the time, it connects with something that sounds like it might be a promising idea to explore in a poem.
That's
and
great.
Sometimes those poems work out, and sometimes they don't work out.
Right, as it is with all writing.
Yes.
And we had talked earlier, and I suggested a poem for you to read.
So I think the one that you mentioned is called Weapons of Peace.
Yes.
And it's from a book called Knitting Matters, which was the award winner in the crafts hobby category of the New Mexico Arizona Book Awards this year. Weapons of Peace. I retired as a teacher before I faced a mass shooter in my class. Could I have been the human shield to save my students, or would I have flinched? Outside class, can anyone help a 10-year-old boy not want to be a school shooter? Can we teach him to grow seedlings, write a poem, restore a car, knit a beanie, join a poetry community, find the patience to give back, the will to not harm? Teachers should not be weaponized. Instead, generously armed with books, seeds, sewing needles, we must use loving arms, help students read, write, make their own books, embrace life. I want to put hammers, nails, wood, cotton, sewing machines, knitting wool into the hands of curious children. Trowels, shovels, drill presses teach craftsmanship, pride, service to others, skills that serve everyone in the community. We must arm children, charm, disarm children with tools that engage them in the many arts of living. And the other poem that you mentioned is called The Color of Knitting in My World. New Mexico, where I live, is the most non-pastel state of the Union, a reason to love the place. Who doesn't love the bold skies, the sandstone desert landscapes of this enchanted land, the turquoises, teals, rusts, the multitudinous green patinas in each prickly pear pad? New Mexicans love earthiness, earthy colors, hanging ristras of dusky chilies, adobe mud walls, blue wooden gates, turquoise jewelry. The clarity of earth and sky teaches me honest color. As a knitter, I admire, never quite reach, the genius of colors I see all over my state.
Thank you. I love both of those poems.
Oh, well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That's lovely to hear. I have one other poem that was the first poem that I wrote when I realized, knitting poetry. I could write about knitting.
Oh.
And I was in a rural area in New Mexico, and I realized that I was stopped at a stoplight. There was no one behind me, and I was knitting. And I looked at I sort of looked over at myself and thought, what am I doing? What is this? What am I doing here? And how can I describe this to someone who's not a knitter?
Right.
And so this is called Knitticut Reminders to My Highest Knitting Self. And this was sort of an awareness that maybe knitting was becoming too important in my life. And it's from a book called Knititude, Living in Stitches. I don't know if I sent you that.
You did, yes.
That book.
Yes.
Okay. So this is my first knitting poem. No more knitting while driving. No more knitting while texting and driving. No more knitting while hair drying and driving. No more knitting while eyelinering, hair drying and driving. No more texting while knitting and driving. No more dawdling at stop signs to finish knitting one more row. I will not knit fun fur in a bikini. I will not bring more than 3 fun fur projects on vacation. I will lint roller my hands, arms, and face if I knit fun fur. I will not shake off fun fur in my sister's car if I happen to forget not to knit fun fur. I will stop bragging about the price of fun fur when I made my killing back in '88. I will not hide the surplus wool in the oven anymore, so I will not preheat the sock yarn when I'm baking. I will remember to defrost the freezer fiber and no longer insist I can knit frozen mohair. I will never again serve the Angora wool as a vegetable instead of frozen peas. I will always pretend to be more interested in your grandchildren photos than in my symmetrical decreases. I will not insist on knitting pastel sweaters for my 30-year-old children. I will no longer berate my sons for not wearing my Christmas vest, nor anonymously call my daughter ordering she don hand-knitted socks on Mother's Day. And no more sexist hooting, ridiculing male knitters. No more wine drinking when knitting lace. No more unraveling last night's drunken lace while hungover. No more swearing about the giftee while knitting his mittens. no more unknitting the ex-boyfriend's ex-sweater, no more publicly shaming him by loudly knitting a very small underwear pouch for him. May I remember my new knitting boundaries. May I remember to remember my new knitting boundaries. May I become a more compassionate knitter, and may the hooting and harassing incidents cease almost to a halt. So I was trying to remind myself of some things, some exaggerated things that I haven't actually done, but trying to sort of rein myself in a little bit. And the fun fur is a sort of sleazy synthetic fiber that's usually on sale that I have way too much of just because it's usually on sale. Right. And when I started knitting it, I realized it was sort of a horrible fiber because it sticks to you and it's just sort of slippery. And so I'm sort of making fun of myself a bit about that.
I was laughing through the whole thing because I can relate to so many of those points.
Yes. Well, I think I've met a lot of other knitters who are sort of, unfortunately, can relate to some of those situations.
Right.
But hopefully not all of them at the same time.
Exactly. And we have a new refrain at my home now, just one more row. Yes,
yeah. Well, that's a good one to remember. And to actually, I think knitters who knit too much, whose hands, may be arthritic or need to take that seriously, and I'm among them. And we need to sort of get up every time we do a new row and stretch our legs and walk around, and we need to remind ourselves to get exercise and to move because
right.
The habit of sitting for too long and doing a repetitive motion is something that we now know is not good for us.
It's true, but it's tough to remember that when you're right in the middle of a project.
Yes. Right, yes. Okay, curious about how long you've been interviewing writers.
I've been interviewing writers for about 2 years now.
Huh. And was this a project for a class that you were teaching, or how did this come about?
Well, I was a professor of creative writing at the college here, and then when I retired, my station manager asked if I would like to do this show. And I jumped at the chance. It's wonderful. I always wanted a job where I could read as part of the job.
Yeah.
So that works.
And so the focus is on New Mexican writers.
It's Four Corners writers, which is local and regional, Colorado, Arizona, around the area.
Great.
This is the first book I have ever read about knitting, though.
I'm trying to think if there is anyone writing about knitting in New Mexico, and there may not be. There are a lot of books written about a lot of different aspects of knitting now, but I think the knitting scene is probably bigger as far as a profession goes on the two coasts, and there are a lot of people writing about sheep and the business of yarn and traditions and things like that, and we don't have the traditions are not as strong for knitting in New Mexico. Yeah. Well, there is a real renaissance going on now in the I think in the knitting world, and it's very exciting because people are experimenting with new fibers and really light, beautiful things. They're independent dyers who are painting wools and other fibers, and they're just really beautiful. It's really quite different from when I was growing up in the 60s in New England, where the wool was really scratchy and there weren't many colors.
So have you been knitting your entire life then?
I have since I was maybe 8 or 9. I saw my mom, and she was always knitting, and so that was a way to spend time with her, was to start knitting too. And so I've been knitting for quite a while.
And how long have you been writing then?
I retired as an English teacher about 6 years ago, and I started writing about 3 or 4 years ago. I first wrote about my dog who was kind of badly behaved, and I was trying to understand him, and that attempt turned into a lot of poems about different aspects of his behavior, and his he died unexpectedly. So I wrote a lot about that. And that was about 3 years ago. Then I wrote about our president about 3 years ago, and then I started writing. I've written 5 knitting books in the last 2 years, and I think there's one more book. I can think of another book full of knitting poems, and then I think it's going to be time to move on to something else.
Oh.
And so I'm trying to think of what that will be. In the meantime, a group of poets in Albuquerque we're working on a project that's just starting now that I think I'm going to work on editing a book for this, and it's called Speak with the Poet, and we're celebrating the centennial of women getting the right to vote, which happened in 1920.
Right.
And we are stationing ourselves every twice a week, maybe at different places around Albuquerque, and we interview. We have a table, and we have a laptop, and we have a portable printer, and we spend 5 minutes talking to someone who would like to tell us about an important woman in their life, and then we write a poem, and we print it and give it to them, and then we keep a copy, and I'm going to help put a book together that's going to be about the women who we learn about through this project. And so I think that's going to be really fun.
That sounds
really
so
exciting.
fun. Is that in Albuquerque?
Yes, it's in Albuquerque. And although if someone wanted to do it somewhere else in Farmington, we would welcome, the collaboration of other people picking up this idea. But a friend of mine who's retired, but who's a poet, she's retired from another profession, had heard about this in New York, and where it's an annual event. And she thought it would be fun to celebrate women this year and this momentous achievement of getting the right to vote, and focus, sort of teach this moment in history at the same time, and then collect poems about women. And so we're going to be doing that for 6 months around Albuquerque. And I'm going to go, actually, as soon as I finish this interview, I'm going to one of the libraries and do the first one that I've done, and then I'm going to go to the VA. That's going to be the regular place that I go, to the recreational building in Albuquerque, and I'm going to be interviewing vets about that topic.
Oh, that's great.
So I think there's another book that's coming.
Oh, yeah. I noticed that on the covers of both Knititude and Knitting Matters, you have a graphic that reminds us of Rosie the Riveter.
Yes, that's correct. I was looking for something that would pull people into reading knitting poetry, which is not really a genre niche that anyone knows about. And I thought, I've got to make a simple cover that's graphically interesting. And I have a friend who's a poet and a graphic designer, and she helped design that idea. And so once we did the first one, we thought, well, we're going to link the other books to the first book by using the same image. And she had drawn it. We just sort of made up some knitting tattoos that we thought would be interesting to wear. And so she put that together, and it's been great because it helps to sort of keep the books together as a set, because they are kind of connected to one another.
They are, and that, like I said, that image speaks a lot itself.
Yeah.
Another poem of yours that I really liked. You don't have to read this one if you don't wish, but I really connected with the one with the TSA taking away needles.
Yeah, that I think a lot of knitters have experienced that, and knitting is a perfect activity for a plane flight because it calms you down.
Absolutely.
And you don't focus on your anxiety, and you can get stuff done. You can't do anything else when you're sitting there. So it's a perfect time. So to have your needles ripped away from you is just a nightmare situation, and basically in the United States, the TSA is not doing that. I mean,
Right.
they've realized that knitting needles are not a weapon. They're actually pacifying that whoever has them, and they have not been ever used as a weapon. So it's only in certain other countries, and it's just very arbitrarily enforced. And so there's a lot of discussion in the knitting community about how to sort of handle this situation. And basically, there are knitting needles that unscrew, and so you can take the tips off and put them in a pencil case sort of next to the pencils so they don't stand out. And then the cord in between the two tips of the needles, you just put, somewhere it doesn't stand out without the needle tips on. And so then you can reassemble it when you get back on the plane and not lose your very valuable to yourself needles the way I did. And I happened to just be had two projects that I brought on, and so I had to give up two sets of needles in Mexico City, and it was just an unforgettable evening or unforgettable afternoon on the way back here.
Yes, I don't know if others can, but knitters can certainly relate to the pain that would cause.
Yes. Well, hopefully that will not happen to other people.
Right, because I researched it really carefully, and it said, no, knitting needles are okay, but obviously not always.
No. And it's hard to argue with someone who's a security agent in another country. You don't really want to, incur their wrath. You just want to sort of get through it.
Right.
And go home.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah.
Where can listeners find these books?
Oh, I on Amazon.
Okay.
It's my name spelling is odd. It's my last name is Baldrige. It's Megan Baldridge, and I have 5 knitting poetry books on Amazon, and I have a book about our president of poems about him, and a book about my dog there as well. And that's probably the easiest way.
Okay.
I have books in a local bookstore in Albuquerque, but if you're not in Albuquerque, that probably doesn't help.
But they're definitely worth reading. I enjoyed them very much.
Oh, good. Well, thank you. And I like your thought of handing them on to the library.
Right.
And speaking of that, I'm off to the library right now to write some quick poetry.
Great.
It's been lovely to talk to you. Well, thank you very much, Tracy, and thanks for giving a voice to knitting poetry.
You bet.
Those of us in the knitting poetry niche, like me, appreciate that.
Okay. Thank you again.
And good luck with your knitting.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And that was Megan Baldridge talking about knitting and poetry and her award-winning book, Knitting Matters. This is Tracy Hales-Vass with Right on Four Corners on KSJE 90.9 FM in Farmington, New Mexico.